Well, welcome everybody to our what appears to be our last section of the conference. It has been a long-standing tradition to end the conference with a literary panel. And Jarek would remember that at the very beginning, probably the first or the second conference, the second day on Saturday consisted of Professor Arnold Macmillan's paper. So there was just one paper on Belarusian literature. Since those times, we've expanded, and it's also wonderful to see that we are on our second day in the Skarina Library discussing culture, literature, language, and that there is a steady increase in submissions on libraries and archives. And that is a new development. We've had it for just a few recent years. So this panel is dedicated to libraries and archives. And I will just say that all the presenters will have about 16, 17 minutes. And the first presenter today is Dasha Lis, who is a PhD student at Queen Mary University of London. Dasha's research topics include heritage, education, and postcolonial studies. And her topic today is Reframing Postcolonial Discourse in East European Studies, case study of the Belarus collection at the British Library. Over to you, Dasha.
Thank you, Karalina. Thank you for this introduction and for this chance to speak here. The title of this presentation is the title of the PhD that I applied for. So it's not something that I sort of formulated myself, but it was something I was interested in. And so today I think I will share kind of insights from the work that I do. It's still the work in progress, so there'll be more questions than answers to kind of my thinking about this. And any group insights will be absolutely welcome to this. So the question that this project that's this. Okay. So essentially, the project that the British Library, which is I think you probably all know the British Library is, it's a big institution in the UK that collects all sorts of world heritage, has hundreds of kilometers of materials in its storage and so on, clearly has some Belarusian materials in its midst. And the request came in to kind of make sense of it, like how to understand the Belarus collection within the British Library, and how to interpret it, how to organize it, how to sort it. And clearly the project in itself is quite huge. So the idea was to basically select a few key individuals that have some association with either printed materials or have produced something in print and have a strong resonance with Belarusian-ness. Now, what is Belarusian-ness we can discuss, and I guess this is the essence of the project. And then these 5 people that I'm looking at studying is Karalina, Kostis Kalinowski, Kupala, Shemyakin, and Svetlana Alexievich. You can see it's a wide range of people who have connection to Belarus, and the kind of the history aspect of it is something I could have presented in the conference yesterday. It deals a lot with how the symbolic meaning of these people is constructed within the kind of Belarusian period, in pre-Soviet times, Soviet period, and in post-Soviet Belarus. And then application of that research, how can we apply them to the collection in the British Library so we can better interpret that. So today I'm going to look just at the second part in kind of what the insights can give us in how to work with materials. And I will only look at Karalina, Kalinowski, and Alexievich within the collection and pose a lot of questions that kind of library is grappling with. So to start with kind of overview of how this process works, to decolonize a library seems to be a very straightforward process. You have to look critically at collection, which in case of British Library, it's very difficult because you actually don't quite know what constitutes the Belarusian collection, and then look at how the knowledge is described, how it's categorized, and then look at what is the knowledge centers and how can be that can be shifted to give a little bit more voice to, for example, Belarusian-ness that actually very often is hidden under either Russian Empire or the Soviet Union or Russia nowadays, right? So it's a little bit to give the voices to perspective that perhaps is kind of hidden in the mainstream collection. And then, but that seems easy. However, in practice, it's really, really difficult to do because there's a lot of question about the Belarusian identity to start with, and particularly there's very kind of difficulty in understanding the pre-Soviet identity of Belarus because the argument is the nation did not exist, and therefore it's difficult to categorize something as national when there was no nation. And then comes the Soviet Union, and British Library was very interested, particularly in the Cold War time, to collect anything to do with the Soviet Union because it gives the knowledge. But Belarus was just a part of that. And then comes the independence in 91, and British Library is like, oh my God, how do you understand this? We know nothing. Can you help us? And so they're struggling to kind of comprehend how to do that. And on top of that, as a heritage institution, it also deals with questions such as, do we address collection holistically, or do we look at specific, for example, authors or specific materials that we would like to collect, because then they represent a heritage. And then if we do collect something, do we work with what kind of approaches to interpretation do we use? And so the examples that I will have kind of summarize all these problems and tensions that arise. And the first example is Karalina, and I don't think I need to talk a lot about Karalina in this audience. It represents the duality of interpretation. So for the British Library, which does hold Karalina books, there is obviously universal significance. Karalina produced something that is of relevance, of interest to global cultural community. And he published his books, and he's kind of the father of the East Slavonic printing and so on. And he was obviously of interest to Slavists, to historians, to researchers, and so on. So how do we gather that in a library to signify this interest? And on top of that, there's definitely a very different or additional significance for Belarusians, right? Again, I don't need to perhaps elaborate too much on that, but Karalina is a symbol of Belarus. And there was this kind of, the making of Karalina has happened over the, from the pre-Soviet times. The Soviet authorities kind of appropriated the Belarusian national history into kind of Soviet narrative, and then it was reclaimed afterwards. Like, I mean, example really would be 1991, when usually in the Soviet times, the 1st of September lesson would start with, lecture on Lenin, lesson on Lenin. In post an independent Belarus, it was the lesson on Karalina. So it's a big significance for Belarusians. Clearly, it also is represented in kind of the production of the Karalina materials that Belarusians have created, Kariniana of sorts, which the British Library does also have. However, this kind of Karalina and this Karalina, they don't communicate with each other in a library. So, for example, yeah, I already. Oh, back. So the actual Karalina texts, they are not collected within the kind of like Slavonic kind of part. It's more with the rare books, with rare materials. And at that time, when these books were acquired, they were part of the British Museum, right? So there's in descriptions, you will find provenance information on how the books were acquired, who bought them for how much money, and so on, right? But clearly, there's a very little kind of updated information on who Karalina was. For example, you can see that the dates of death, for example, is wrong, and any reference to Belarus will be this White Russian dialect. That's it. There is absolutely nothing. So there is some kind of need for updating, definitely is there. On top of that, these kind of books, they're not linked at all to this material. So British Library does have a lot of stuff from research from late 19th century, so Russian Empire, studying the Severozapad Krai and so on. And then we have the whole gamut of different texts produced, obviously in the 20th century, but Karalina in the 21st century as well. But the question that libraries grapples with is, how should the library approach the kind of curation of, I guess, early modern heritage materials, which later acquired national claim, right? If someone like Belarus comes along and says, hey, actually has a very significant connection to us, how should library be convinced that there is a link? And this is, I think, is kind of the tension that kind of we need to figure out how to present, how to address, how to convince the library that actually there is more to Karalina than manuscripts that very few people actually see. So that's one part of that. And then there's this guy, I mentioned already today, I think, and yesterday, Postcolonial, which again has resonance for Belarus. Clearly, he's one of the leaders of the Polish uprising in 1863-64. For Belarusians, he's of significance because of his publishing of Muzhitskaya Pravda, the first underground newspaper sort of appealing to Belarusians in Belarusian language. And he, just like Karalina, was appropriated for the Soviet cause in the Soviet times, where the class struggle element of Postcolonial was emphasized. And I think it's the first presentation on the film today. We saw Postcolonial, the film in Russian by Gagarin. Definitely, it's the kind of the rebel who is fighting against the both Polish and Russian aristocracy. And clearly, the Kalinowski now is a very contested figure, particularly in the 21st century, elections 2006, 2010, and so on, Kalinowski Square, because he became not just a symbol of the kind of independence for Belarus, but symbol of resistance to any kind of oppression, including the oppression within Belarus. And therefore, right now, you can imagine he's a very politically tense figure. And I think echoes with Nikolai's presentation and textbooks. He is the one which Belarusian government at the moment really reducting a lot in the textbooks. So from being one of the 3 people who throughout the Soviet Union have appeared with a picture in the history textbook, the picture has been removed. He is now not described as a hero. He is going into neutral character. And now, as again, like Nikolai's presentation, is more of a Polish bad guy. So that's the trajectory of Kalinowski. And therefore, again, how can the library kind of deal with this information? Library has very little interest in Muzhitskaya Pravda. What Kalinowski produced is not of essence, but it's way more concerned with, was he Lithuanian? Was he Polish? Was he Russian? Because in library, we catalog him. We need to put him in some kind of category, and we need to know what category that guy is. And I looked at the spelling of the names, and this is the official Library of Congress spelling, so you can find Kalinowski in any way you want. And in the British Library, he is definitely Belarusian, right? So it means he is presented as a Belarusian, but it's not that he's presented that way. It means that there are lots of Belarusian texts where Kalinowski is featured, which means that if you do want to find him, for example, in Polish, you may find him in some texts, but it will not be necessarily labeled, because the text will be, for example, about uprising, and you have to find the book about uprising, and maybe within it you can find Kalinowski, but he will not be like listed. And also these names are not connected. And some of the kind of example here, it's the same. The book by the same author published several years apart in 60s and 59. It's the kind of Smirnov's biography. He wrote about the revolutions in Eastern Europe, and Kalinowski definitely was part of that. But look, one text is linked to Kalinowski, Kostu Semyonovich, Belarusian version of that, and this one's clearly linked to the Polish name of this, right? So this little bit disjointedness that makes it very difficult to kind of to study this. And then the question is, how can we help the library to make sense of all of these political tensions, but also kind of the nuances of identity that the library is interested in, because it's a state institution that is interested in kind of political identity developments, but struggling to grasp it, right? So that will be the kind of second example. And then the third example, I think, unlocks the whole gamut of questions, which is this Svetlana Alexievich, right? Because first of all, Svetlana Alexievich has been collected by library even before she became the Nobel Prize winner, because she writes texts that are not fiction. So library is not interested in fiction collection, but it is interested in article publications and documentary materials and so on. So Alexievich kind of like slid into that category. However, the Nobel Prize winner obviously shoot her up in interest, right? So there's a need, we have to collect her. It's obviously of global sort of significance. And then came the questions. who is she? How do we actually, again, categorize her? Because she's the person who represents this complexity of identities, and she is the person who, in the present, still is changing and like expressing this variety of identities linguistically and ethnically and otherwise, and that and library struggles to understand how to react to that. And what is clearly emerging that the approach goes right away into kind of ethnic representations. They look into, okay, she's Ukrainian and she's Belarusian, but she writes in Russian. That confusion already becomes problematic. And then, but she writes about also Soviet Union. And we have category for Soviet Union. So where do we put her in? But she writes right now, and Soviet Union no longer exists. So what do we do? And all of this creates a lot of interesting questions. On top of that, what they realized that because they're now interested in collecting Alexievich is that no Alexievich text is the same. And in fact, the whole Alexievich example kind of breaks a lot of the library policies or makes them reconsider that. For example, library does not collect doubles. So if you have the same book, you will not collect two of the same. However, what we know with Alexievich, that she, even if the book is published in different years with the same title, it's not going to be quite the same book, right? For example, library has this book, which is the first edition of Войны женское лицо. And in the first edition, there were pictures of photographs of the women who are interviewed in her book. You will not find these pictures anywhere in any other publication, right? So there's a changes to that. Also, if you look at the text, you can see that in every succeeding edition, Alexievich edits herself or is edited. So she adds the bits or removes the bits and then comments on why she did so and so. So no text is the same, but if you look at the library catalog, you will end up with a lot of «Войны женское лицо» 10 copies, right? It's already kind of problematic from the policy of collection in the library. On top of that, obviously the interest in translation come in. So you can see that she has always been translated in some languages, but after the Nobel Prize, she was translated into 27 languages in each of the years, and library became actively collecting that, but mostly in European languages. And when this came in, it also broke another policy of the library, because library does not collect, Belarusian collection does not collect translations into Belarusian. However, in Alexievich's case, this rule had to be broken because it opens up the whole other thing. For example, my argument that you have to collect translations into Belarusian, whether it's Alexievich or not, whoever it is, because we have endangered language and we have language that speaks a bit more than just communication of the knowledge. And therefore, plus what Igor talked yesterday about intraterrestrial publishing, right? Extraterritorial, it's not terrestrial, it's like ET coming in. Extraterritorial publishing, because this also opens up the whole thing of like, if you're collecting books that are published on the territory of Belarus, you want to create the collection, you have to now also look at all the extraterritorial publishing, because that will be mostly the publishing that is happening of relevance to a particular narrative of Belarus today. And maybe on the last point to make, when all these different translations started coming into Belarus, I did a little of a side project looking at how these translations are done. And it's also interesting because it gives you kind of an idea of how Belarus is perceived by different languages. So for example, this is the French translation of the Secondhand Time, and you can see that the word Secondhand Time did not translate. The publisher did not like the appeal of the Secondhand Time because it didn't resonate with their French readers. But what resonates is obviously is the time of his enchantment of the Red Man. So all of these terms that the West is familiar with makes it to the thing, to the cover. And I pointed out that the covers are also different. You can see that this person is leaving the page. This person is marching straight on. So this is the kind of the things that I think have to be pointed out, and then looked in the library how to deal with. And ultimately, just to finish off, all of this is a really kind of, you can see it's a mesh of things. But what I advocate is to move away from kind of one-dimensional kind of catalog and create sort of a map that is agile, that is responsive to changes, and that you can link all sorts of different identities, languages, and knowledges together, so you don't have to constantly struggle with defending a particular narrative over the other. and in kind of very post-colonial manner can say, can we all be all of this at the same time? Done. On time?
Thank you very much, Dasha. Our next presenter is Lesia Pcholka. Lesia is an artist, researcher, and curator of the VEHA archive in Germany and Poland. And her title today is Visual Studies of Everyday Life, the VEHA archive of Belarusian vernacular photography. VEHA London 003. O, VEHA. Niżej to jest 003. Ja zmochę. So, hello everyone. Yeah, actually, I'm sharing too about strategy of collecting a little, but more with artistic way. Actually, I changed a little bit my presentation after yesterday presentation, yours presentation, and I'm just trying to sharing my method of work, and maybe it's inspired you. I don't know. So I work with photography, and photography it's a young art, but because photos can be easily copied, quickly became a part of all areas of social life, and is now everywhere. Okay, the microphone. Просто function. Our understanding of photography has not developed as quickly as the medium itself. The art historical approach, for example, Walter Benjamin studies photography from the point of view of the author's aesthetics and creativity. The archaeological method which I use sees photography as a form of visual evidence and an archive of the social and cultural system in which it exists. I propose to look at the photo in three plans, like looking at a window. The scene in front of the glass itself, and through it. And let's try it now. First, please look subject of the photo. What we see now, what we understand, the image we recognize. In this case, we evaluate how we look, our personal experience and the situation itself now in the audience as we see it. And we are in front of the glass. And another way to look at the photo as a surface. Look for the folds, marks, scratches. We can see the back of the photo, but the online forums has another criteria, such whether or not made editing or AI has been used, and or solution of image. And for our example, we see the photo like only on the screen with another like frames. So now we look surface on the glass. And finally, there is the invisible context behind the photo. They included the story of its creation, the time it was taken, the historical and political context, and the personal signature. We look through the image as through the glass. Dobra.
I can repeat after personally. Okay, so next one. Now we look at the group of 3 photos. This creates a completely different perception. This is how VEHA archive, which I found in 2017, works. We collect vernacular photography from Belarusian family albums. We use only digital copies sent directly by people through open calls. People scan their photos and send them to us by mail. For us, it is important not take the material away, but to show that what is kept in a family is important for the history of our community. We work with Belarusian family archives and study how photography shapes memory and history today. We use vernacular photography from family albums to explore everyday life through ordinary image and shares visual tradition. These photographs focus on family rituals and daily moments. Through them, we can see a collection to history, collective drama, and contemporary life. For example, you see the collection, what we have now. For example, it's a wedding photography, funeral photos, photos with destroyed buildings, and other. We currently have 10 thematic collection. People send for us just not only photo with short description, where is who in the photos, where it was taken and when. And my colleagues catalyze photo in our core archive. We're using Excel. Yeah. I communicate with all photo providers by mail. Sometimes people send the stories or just ask questions, and we try to be attentive to everyone. This part of our work is not very visible, but it's very important for us. It's important that people begin to openly sharing their memories. Because in authoritarian countries like Belarus, history often belongs to the state, not to the people. And state control all narratives. We choose to work with everyday life photography because it's not directly political, and it's safer for the people who share their archive with us. We collect only digital copy. At the same time, we want to this image to exist in physical form, so we publish books based on research into the material we have collected. 5 books have already published. Our newest, it's called Ruins of Belarus. I have it here, and you can find on Karalina library and Karalina bookshop. Yeah. Is this books about accepting the incomplements of political system as ounce or characteristic in order to find the strength to move on. Another direction of our work is exhibition. We invite artists who work with VEHA collection and creative contemporary artworks. This helps to open a new way to see everyday life image and the hidden context inside them. I don't have, maybe I don't have a right to call myself like researcher. I'm a research-based artist, because I'm not just study, I'm creating, and I'm trying to product and show it new vision for our history and some invisible side of our history. I work with absence, creative image, which help to interpret the past, and I do is usually language, contemporary art. Art is actually more flexible form to presentation, flexible space for displaying, searching, and exchanging a new idea. And for Belarusians, I think it's one of form to survive, to showing what you actually doing and collecting new audience for your research. For me, it's more important and for me important to make more popular our culture. And I think now we found maybe more related form to survive, living in exile, but still working with people who still live inside the Belarus. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lesia. And our third presenter is Dr. Maria Katarzyna Prenner, who is a researcher at the University of Graz, Austria. Maria Katarzyna works in the field of formal and social linguistics. Her habilitation project is dedicated to the development and emergence of the standard of written language in Belarusian. Katarzyna's topic is between Latin and Cyrillic, AI-supported HTR and orthographic annotation of 20th century Belarusian newspapers, methodological challenges and insights. Over to you, Katarzyna.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction. And yeah, as already mentioned, I would like to talk about this particular topic, and the material I'm working on is located, sorry, I have my presentation here on the phone, so it's a bit challenging for me to read, yeah. So the material I'm working with is located in the intersection of historical linguistics, script history, digital humanities, and Slavic philology. And more specifically, I'm interested in Belarusian newspapers from the late 19th century, which is Muzhitskaya Pravda, that was already mentioned, and newspapers from the beginning of the 20th centuries, a period which Belarusian was still in a pre-orthographical phase in, and was written in both Latin and Cyrillic scripts. So my talk has 4 main parts. First, I will briefly, really briefly, so I will jump over some slides, I guess, introduce the linguistic and script historical backgrounds in Belarusian. Second, I will focus on digitization attempts using transcribus for both Latin and Cyrillic script newspapers. Third, I will focus on one specific orthographic phenomenon, namely the establishment of akanie and jakanie as an orthographic principle, especially in Nasza Niwa in 1907. And finally, I will give a short outlook on how AI might be used for orthographic annotation in future work, because as you may assume, this is a time-consuming task if you do this all manually. So to the historical background, very quick. To understand the methodological challenges of digitizing these newspapers, we need to understand the historical position of Belarus. And we know that historically Belarusian lands have been situated between East and West, between Slavia Latina and Slavia Orthodoxa. And this position was political, cultural, religious, and script related. And this is all reflected throughout my material. And I thank my colleague from Greifswald who already mentioned that today. And from the 14th century on, yeah, here again, the Lithuanian statute. From the 14th century onward, these territories belonged to larger political entities, including the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the Russian Empire, and later the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. And the history directly influenced language and script choice, of course. And Ruthenian, the predecessor of modern Belarusian and Ukrainian, was originally written in Cyrillic and served later as an official language of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And later, to close contacts with Poland, the Latin script was imported and became a written tradition. And therefore, Belarusian developed a context of long-term biscriptality. In the 19th century and in the early 20th centuries, Belarusian dialects began to develop into a modern standard language, but this process did not happen within one stable orthographic system, of course, which was also today already mentioned. Yeah. Instead, Belarusian was written in both in Cyrillic and Latin, and both systems were associated with different cultural and political orientations. And choosing the Latin script in the 19th century, especially in the 19th century, could be understood as a way of distancing Belarusian identity from Russian Empire. And while also, on the other hand, it expressed solidarity with the Polish independence movement. Kastuś Kalinowski was already mentioned. So Cyrillic, on the other hand, connected Belarusians more directly to the East Slavic and Orthodox sphere. And during the 19th century, the Cyrillic script was a neutral script in comparison with the Latin script. So from the beginning, script choice was not neutral, yeah, as for the Latin script. And it was connected to questions of identity, politics, religion, and cultural orientation. An important monument is the church bell of Moldova from the 16th century. You see it in the engravement, maybe not so good, but it applies the orthographic principles of Polish. And on the other hand, here we have the Bychowiec Chronicle here in a copy by Theodor Narbut. The original was lost in a fire in Moscow in 1812. So we see that here also the orthography resembles Polish orthographic rules of that time. And of course, very prominently again, Kastuś Kalinowski with Murzyckaja Prawda. I think I do not have to mention a lot about Murzyckaja Prawda, except for the fact that only 7 issues appeared, but the newspaper is historically very significant, yeah. And its main contributor, Kastuś Kalinowski, was later hanged, was later sentenced to death of his anti-Tsarist activity, and his famous letters from beneath the gallows were also written in Latin script, and he supported the Latin script very much. Yeah. So and I will jump over that very quick. So later newspapers, including Nasza Niwa, for example, Belarus, Homań, Krynica, Swietacz, which is on that slide, and other newspapers I have collected show a wide range of script and orthographic practices, and some appeared in Latin script. Some of them appeared simultaneously both in Latin and in Cyrillic script, and some of them only in Cyrillic script. And the choice of alphabet was usually determined by the religious orientation of the readership at that time: Latin script for Catholics and Cyrillic script for Orthodox Christians. And this is the historical setting in which my digitization work takes place. So there is a bunch of newspapers I have collected, and yeah, it's a very time-consuming task to digitize them all. Okay. So why digitize the newspapers? The central question or the central reason for digitizing this material is that early Belarusian newspapers provide crucial evidence for development of Belarusian orthography, yeah, between two scripts, yeah. But they are difficult to work with for several reasons. First, they belong to the pre-orthographic phase of Belarusian, and there was no fully standardized spelling system. Writers, editors, yeah, and publishers were still experimenting with how Belarusian should be represented in writing. And second, there is considerable variation between the two alphabets. The Latin and Cyrillic versions of the same or similar text do not always represent the same sounds in the same way. For example, here we have tsiom na ye, and here tsiom no ye, so the akanye is missing, yeah. And the long-term aim is to therefore to create a corpus that includes both alphabets and allows for POS, this means part of speech tagging, and orthographic annotation, yeah, which to my knowledge was never made for such corpora. And such a corpus would make it possible to analyze variation and regularities in a systematic way. And there is where transcribus becomes very, very useful, and it allows us to train text recognition models on historical print material and then apply those models to larger amounts of data. And however, as I will show, the results depend very strongly on script typeface, graphemic inventory, and orthographic variation. And in this sense, digitization is not only a technical preliminary step, it is already closely connected to the linguistic question of my whole project. So in this slide, this is very linguistic, but I will try to explain it in a understandable manner. So one important example of variation is the representation of palatalization, soft sign, and diacritics in the Latin script. Which, well, palatalization is the softness of consonants. In this example, we can see how the two alphabets followed different models. Cyrillic was oriented towards Russian model, representing these forms without the soft sign, whereas Latin script followed the Polish model using special diacritics to mark palatalization. And in a larger scale study, I was able to show that Cyrillic initially followed the Russian orthographic model quite closely. And later, however, yeah, so this is this graph here. Later, however, it gradually adapted the orthographic principles already established in the Latin alphabet, which had marked palatalization quite regularly from the beginning. And this therefore provides evidence that orthographic principles are dependent on the alphabet used. And so the Latin alphabet served as a model for the Cyrillic alphabet, and therefore for the Taraszkiewicza, which first was published in Latin script and then later in Cyrillic. As for the, in the Latin script, for example, Belarusian newspapers, I analyzed here 4 Belarusian newspapers, Murzycka Prawda, Świetacz, Nasza Dolia, and Nasza Niwa. And they used Polish-style diacritics to mark palatalization here in the center. And at the same time, some Polish digraphs were gradually replaced. These are these ones by Czech-style diacritics. And this took place in Nasza Niwa around 1911. And in other Catholic newspapers, for example, like Belarus, which is not here, or Homine, Polish digraphs remained in use much, much longer. So, and this means that each newspaper has its own graphemic inventory and also its own graphemic profile. And even if 2 newspapers use the Latin script, they do not necessarily use the same inventory of letters and diacritics. And the same applies to Cyrillic material, and certain distinctions are represented differently. And in some cases, Latin orthographic practices seem to have influence the Cyrillic representation. Yeah, this holds not only for the palatalization thing, but also for other phenomena. And this is important for digitization because text recognition models are very sensitive to exactly these details. A model trained on one newspaper may not work well on another. So let me introduce this now. Let me now turn to the transcribus results for Latin script newspapers. I trained several models, and these models were trained with language settings such as Polish, Czech, and Slovak later. Because of the graphemic inventory of Belarusian script newspapers overlapping with the graphemic inventories of these languages, of course. And the results were often very good. For example, models trained on Nasza Niwa from 1906 and 1907 achieved character error rates below or around 1%, and one model reached a character error rate of 0.8%, which is excellent for historical newspaper material. But of course, it is very effective to reuse one model and to train the next newspaper you want to analyze. And a model based on Nasza Niwa could be, for example, used for Świetacz. Yeah, so here we have the case with Świetacz. Here it worked very good, and I had only a small number of diacritic corrections, especially involving characters such as U with this long dash, Sz z haczką, umlaut and I z dwoma toczkami. And in practice, this meant only 4 to 12 corrections per page. But however, sometimes this was very messy, yeah. And for example, here, this newspaper, the output was much worse. In practice, more than 80% of the output required correction. And this shows that each of the newspapers, we have to train a separate model that often needs correction. So, so we have here, these are the typical errors that are made by transcribus. Yeah, for example, we have their recognition is not always very good for E and C and O. Yeah, maybe probably due to the blurred print or pixelation, or L and T, like the Polish W in Belarusian is L, of course. Byłoby, czytać, yeah. And of course, the different variations of unie składowe, yeah? And of course, ż z toczką and z with this tire, and ż z haczką, yeah. So these were the main errors I could found. And as for the Cyrillic newspapers, they present similar, but in some respects greater difficulties. Self-trained models were also created for Cyrillic script newspapers such as Nasza Niwa and Nasza Dolia, and these models were trained using Ukrainian, of course, and Russian because of the great overlap of the graphemic inventory. And the character error rates were still relatively good. For example, 1.2% and 1.9% and 1.86% and so on. On paper, the results may look promising. However, in practice, Cyrillic recognition often required more correction than Latin recognition. And one reason is that several Cyrillic letters have visually similar square-shaped forms. Yeah, this on this slide. Yeah, and errors frequently occur between letters such as I, P, N, C, D, L, so typically square-shaped letters. And these letters can be especially difficult to distinguish when the print is blurred, damaged, or pixelated. And so there are also confusions between visually similar letters and italic typefaces again, which was also problematic in the Latin script variants. And this required more extensive post correction, and this means that Cyrillic models are usable, but they also demand careful post-correction and probably newspaper-specific model training, which is, yeah, much, yeah, I'm coming to an end. The Akanye problem, we all know Akanye, and my research questions concerning Akanye appearing in the newspapers was the following. Is it dependent on the alphabet, dependent on word class and on frequency, dependent on the syllable? Is it a pretonic or a posttonic syllable? So we all know how Akanye works. I don't think that I should explain it to you. Like we have halava, which is represented in today Belarusian orthography with an A. But in other East Slavic languages, for example, Russian, we also have Akanye, but it is not represented in orthography. And the contact languages like Polish and Lithuanian, which were also discussed today in one presentation, do not have Akanye except in some dialect. So I have analyzed 7 issues of Nasza Niwa in a parallel corpus, so in Latin and in Cyrillic script, and I have analyzed roughly 10,000 tokens each in Latin and Cyrillic, and I did this manually. So it took me 6-7 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, I don't know. Yeah, and so I marked manually the stress of the pretonic and posttonic syllables. And the results are, sorry, and the results are here. Sorry, genau, yeah. So the results show a clear positional difference. Yeah, for Akanye, the pretonic syllable shows very high realization rates in both scripts, about 92% in Latin script and 91% in Cyrillic. And in the posttonic syllable, the rates are lower, but still very high, about 74% in both scripts. And for Yakanye, the picture is less stable. In the pretonic syllable, the realization rate is about 50% in Latin, but almost 69% in Cyrillic. And in the posttonic syllable, the rate drops to about 21% in Latin and only 9% in Cyrillic. And this suggests that Akanye was already represented quite consistently, especially in the pretonic position, but not so consistently in the posttonic position. And Yakanye, however, was less stable and may have been more dependent on the alphabet. But yeah, I need more data. And as for the outlook, yeah, manual annotation, as already mentioned, is very time consuming, and scaling this up to a larger corpus, it is unrealistic. And everything has to be annotated manually. So I came up with the idea to use AI, or whether we could use AI tools that can support us with orthographic annotation. And the idea is to work with source and target pairs. And the source is a historical form containing Akanye or Yakanye. And the target is a generated form without Akanye or Yakanye, based on linguistic knowledge of different orthographic traditions of Belarusian, including Trashkiewicza Narkamoka and the pre-1917 orthography of Russian, of course. Yeah, and in practical terms, the task is to train or prompt AI systems to generate correct targets from historical deep source. Historical source forms and different tools, including ChatGPT, DeepSeek, and Gemini, and they can be tested and evaluated against the already manually annotated corpus. And well, this is my prompt, and this is the output. So on the left-hand side, we have the lexeme taken from the newspaper, and on the right-hand side, we have the generated form of ChatGPT or Gemini. I don't remember now. So at a later stage, it may be also possible to work toward automatic stress detection and automatic identification of forms with and without Akanye and Yakanye in the digitized newspaper material. And I hope that it will work out. Yeah, I will try my best and come next year with the presentation of the results. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Katarzyna. Jarek, do we have a response?
Yeah, you can ask.
Sorry for taking 2 more minutes.
No.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was my plan to convince you.
So can I announce Diego now? Okay. So we've had to make some changes to the structure of the panels, and we've now merged the last 2 panels together. So now I would invite to the floor Dr. Diego Benning Wang, Harvard University, USA. Diego is a historian of the Caucasus, Armenia, Central Asia, and the Russian North in the modern period. And his research areas include ethnic studies and Slavic languages and literatures. Diego's topic today is the first Belarusian book printer and the first Soviet literary jubilee, Francisc Scarina and the Sovietization of Belarus, 1924-1925. Over to you, Diego.
Thank you. I am sharing my screen. Could you please confirm whether you see my screen sharing?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Great. Awesome. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to present my work online. I am joining you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is famous for, among other things, Harvard University, the first university in North America. Cambridge also hosts the oldest printing press in North America, established in the 17th century, which is 100 years after the date often attributed to the establishment of the Belarusian printing press, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. So in the mid-1930s, the Soviet regime began staging large-scale literary jubilees dedicated to pre-Bolshevik literary icons across the different republics of the Soviet Union. And these events transformed figures such as Ferdowsi, Shotaru Saveli, Nizami Ganjavi, Taras Shevchenko, and Pushkin into canonical representatives of Soviet national cultures. And through these mass festivals, the Soviet states promoted an ideologically infused model of national culture that combined historical continuity with revolutionary transformation. So pre-Soviet poets, epic heroes, authors, and cultural figures, including figures of feudal or aristocratic background, were reinterpreted as precursors of socialist cultural development and as usable symbols of the Soviet project of state building and ideological mobilization. So a decade before this all-union paradigm was consolidated, nonetheless, a strikingly comparable event took place in the newly Sovietized Belarus. So in 1925 and 1926, the Soviet Belarusian Republican leadership organized a jubilee commemorating the 400th anniversary of Belarusian book printing, which was associated with Francisc Scarina, after which the Scarina Library is named. And, well, needless to say, most of you, I mean, all of you should know it's an early 16th century printer whose biography remains fragmentary and contested to this day. And several years later, several years after 1925, 1926, little evidence of this jubilee's public celebration would remain. So the Soviet regime and Belarusian Republican institutions seized the commemoration of Scarina's legacy for around 2 decades until the post-war period, by which point large-scale jubilees in honor of national literary icons had already become a standardized feature of Soviet cultural policy. So my project examines the 1925-1926 Scarina Jubilee as an early attempt to construct Belarusian national culture within the Soviet framework. I argue that the Jubilee emerged at the intersection of institutional consolidation, geopolitical competition, and evolving ideological priorities. It was not the product of a mature, centralized Soviet cultural policy, nor did it rest on stable ideological canons or organizational mechanism. Rather, it took place in a newly Sovietized borderland where the boundaries of Belarusian national culture, language, and identity were still being defined, and where rival claims over that culture extended beyond the borders of Soviet Belarus to Belarusian communities and institutions in Western Belarus and the territories of then Poland and Lithuania. So the Karalina Jubilee, therefore, belongs to a longer trajectory that will culminate in the standardized literary festivals of the Stalinist period. It also reveals that the Soviet approach to national cultural production had not been fully formed. So it developed through uneven and locally driven initiatives in the early and mid-1920s, more specifically, by associating Karalina's life and work with the Renaissance. The cultural elites of Soviet Belarus emphasized Belarus's deep historical connections with Western Europe, and that framing would later be revised as Moscow and Soviet Belarusian institutions increasingly emphasized Belarus's historical, cultural, and linguistic ties with Russia and Ukraine in the post-war reinterpretation of Karalina. So the cultural and political landscape of Soviet Belarus in the early and mid-1920s was marked by both the fragility of the newly established Soviet rule and the experimental character of early Soviet nationality policy. During the First World War and the Russian Revolution, Belarus unexpectedly achieved modern national statehood for the first time in 1918. The Belarusian People's Republic briefly existed as an independent state in 1918 before its conquest and partition by Soviet Russia and Poland. The Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, initially SSRB, later on BSSR, it then emerged as a politically contingent ethno-national territorial entity within the Soviet Union, its borders shaped as much by war, diplomacy, and Soviet economic concerns as by ethno-demographic realities. The republic's demographic structure posed immediate challenges. Ethnic Belarusians, particularly Belarusian speakers, were overwhelmingly rural, while the urban centers were administrative, educational, and cultural institutions were dominated by Poles, Russians, Jews, Lithuanians, and Russified Belarusians. So Belarusian national institutions were therefore being constructed in spaces where the bearers of Belarusian national culture often constituted a minority. So under the policy of indigenization, Korenizatsiya, or more specifically, Belarusizatsiya, Belarusization, Soviet authority promoted the Belarusian language and culture and sought to increase the share of titular cadres in the administrative apparatus. In the mid-1920s saw a major expansion of educational and cultural infrastructure. Soviet Belarus developed institutions of higher learning, a growing scholarly community, a creative intelligentsia concerned with Belarusian culture and history, and an expanding network of schools and cultural organizations. And this was the period that contemporaries and later scholars would characterize as a golden age of Belarusian culture. Yet, this flourishing unfolded within a multi-ethnic framework, so alongside Belarusian, Russian, Polish, and Yiddish, while all these languages had official status through much of the 1920s, so Jewish, Polish, and Lithuanian schools and teacher training institutions also expanded. So Belarusization did not mean ethnic homogenization. It operated alongside quasi-parallel institutional structure for other ethnic groups. And at the same time, the reach of Belarusian remained uneven. It made significant inroads in rural primary education and lower-level administration, while Russian continued to dominate urban life, administration, higher education, and many sectors of public communication. So the unsettled character of Belarusian national development was also visible in language standardization, which has been spoken about, and I will not go into all the language reforms. So this instability was not limited to language. The term Belarus itself had acquired its modern ethno-linguistic and territorial meaning in the as late as the 19th century, while the borders of BSSR were not definitively fixed until the aftermath of the Second World War. So in the 1920s, both the territorial scope and cultural content of Belarusian identity remained open to negotiation, And this was the world in which the Karalina Jubilee operated. A setting of recent state formation, ethnodemographic heterogeneity, linguistic experimentation, and shifting priorities in nationality policy. So I'm not going to say too much about Francis Karalina. Most of you know the kind of fragmentary components of his biography. So even the fragmentary biographical record makes clear that Karalina was an exceptional polymath. He was born into a merchant family, was connected to multiple commercial centers, including the town where he was born and raised, one of the oldest cities in Belarus, one of the oldest or most important Orthodox population centers in the in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, later on in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the city of Polotsk. So his life embodied the circulation of people, texts, ideas, and resources across Latin Catholic and Orthodox Christian Europe rather than the confines of a single national tradition. So his printing activity occupied an equally immediate space. The modern concept of Belarus did not exist in his time, nor had a modern Belarusian literary language been recognized as such. The language of his publications rested on Church Slavonic and Vernacular East Slavic speech accessible to broader masses, to broader readerships in Lithuania, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So his first printed book, The Psalter, appeared in Prague in August 1517, not 1524 or 1525. So between 1517 and 1519, he issued a series of biblical excerpts with explanatory notes in Prague, and he then relocated to Vilnius, where he published The Apostle and the little travel book, Malaya Podorozhnaya Knижka, in the mid-1520s, alongside other biblical texts over the next decade. And these editions circulated not only in the lands of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, but also in other East Slavic and Orthodox regions corresponding to parts of modern-day Russia and Ukraine. So for Soviet Belarusian elites in the 1920s, Karalina's legacy was therefore both attractive and difficult. His biography remained uncertain. His birth year had not been firmly established. The date and circumstances of his doctoral degree from the University of Padua were debated. Even his given name was not fixed. So variants and Francis circulated alongside forms associated with the name George, so either Yuri or Georgi. His religious background was also kind of ambiguous, given his presumed Orthodox origins, his residence in Catholic milieus, and possible Protestant influence, and the absence of explicit denominational declarations in the text he printed. So these uncertainties did not prevent Soviet Belarusian political and cultural elites from monumentalizing Karalina as a national cultural icon. And they did, however, complicate any simple effort to personify him as in the manner of later Soviet literary jubilees. In fact, the jubilee itself was not anchored to the date of Karalina's first printed book in the year of 1517, which I discussed earlier. Instead, it commemorated the 400th anniversary of Belarusian book printing, as opposed to book printing in Belarus. So in the year of 1925, 1926, by foregrounding his later printing activity in Vilnius in the year of 1525. So this mattered because Vilnius lay outside the borders of Soviet Belarus and had possibly never had it never had a Belarusian majority, but is widely considered the Belarusian cultural center, one of the Belarusian cultural centers, if not the Belarusian cultural center, especially at that part of the 20th century. So the shift from Belarusian book printing to printing in Belarus, which appeared in publications associated with the Jubilee, allowed Soviet Belarusian institutions to draw Vilnius into a broader Belarusian historical and cultural landscape. So the origins of the Karalina Jubilee also reveal its transnational and competitive character. One of the earliest articulations of the idea appeared in April and May 1924 in the, back then it was called Kobno, if I'm not mistaken, the city of Kaunas, capital of Lithuania. So in a Kobno or Kaunas-based Belarusian language journal, Krivich, which was edited by Vaslav Lastovsky. The journal framed the coming year as a jubilee year marking 4 centuries of Belarusian printing and called for the participation of local ethnic Belarusians in Lithuania. In June 1924, only a month later, the Ukrainian-born, half-Serbian Soviet Belarusian scholar Vladimir Pcholka advanced a similar proposal within the academic institutions of Soviet Belarus. And crucially, he emphasized that parallel commemorative initiatives were already taking shape in Lithuania and Poland. The adoption of the Jubilee by Soviet Belarusian authorities should therefore be understood not simply as a Soviet cultural initiative, but as a response to competing claims over Skarina and over the custodianship of Belarusian national culture. Pcholka insisted that although commissions had already been established in Vilna and Kovno, the academic, cultural, and national center of the Jubilee had to be in Minsk. And the insistence reveals the reactive and improvisational character of the Soviet adoption of the Jubilee. The commemorative events in Poland and Lithuania took place in late March 1925 under the aegis of local Belarusian political organizations and churches and coincided with commemorations of the 7th anniversary of Belarusian independence. The Soviet Belarusian Jubilee, however, followed only 9 months later with a more pronounced political tinge. So the main events of the Skarina Jubilee in Soviet Belarus took place from December 29th through December 31st, 1925, alongside the 7th anniversary of the establishment of SSRB and the 3rd anniversary of the establishment of the proclamation of the Soviet Union. So this timing was not incidental. Over the preceding year and a half, Pcholka's proposal had been transformed into a broad participatory mass festival. So a Jubilee Commission was established within the Institute of Belarusian Culture, the Inbielkut, within weeks of Pcholka's proposal. So alongside Pcholka, this commission also included prominent cultural figures such as Vsevolod Ignatovsky and Yakub Kolas. So by February 1925, Soviet Belarusian officials had decreed the Jubilee to be a holiday on an all-Republican scale and a mass holiday, which required the participation in schools and workers' clubs across the Republic. And the most elaborate events took place in the capital, Minsk, in that period. So on December 30th, 1925, a bust of Skarina was unveiled in the main hall of Inbielkut. Branislav Epimach-Shipila, who was the senior member of the Institute, declared that he was unveiling a monument to his compatriot, the renowned and learned doctor and academic from Poland, and he concluded, "Long live Belarusian printing, long live Belarusian culture." And later that evening, students of the Belarusian Communist University gathered around leading scholars and for lectures on Skarina, even though the university was supposed to be closed for winter break. And 3 days later, a 2-week Jubilee exhibition opened at the Belarusian State Library and displayed Skarina's 1517 Prague Psalter alongside hundreds of old manuscripts from across Europe. Ironically, the 1525 Vilnius edition of the Apostle, in whose honor the Jubilee was ostensibly being held, was absent. So events also took place across the Republic. In Babruisk, workers and soldiers gathered for speeches by party officials and university professors. In Vitebsk, ceremonial gatherings featured speeches, Belarusian music and dances. In Orsha or Vorsha in that period, a Jubilee exhibition was held under a portrait of Skarina in a printing house renamed after him. And in Chervin, all cultural institutions were instructed to hold events promoting the Belarusian language, and a school was renamed after Skarina. In Horki, the Belarusian State Agricultural Academy declared the day a holiday, held a Jubilee Gala, and renamed its main library in Skarina's order. And reports also describe participation by trade union members, Red Army soldiers, farmers, school children, students, workers, and peasants. So apart from this, the other major center of the Jubilee celebrations was Poland, Skarina's birthplace.
Excuse me, Diego, you have 1 minute?
Oh, I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to fast forward to the post-war period. There are lots of extravagant events that took place at the turn of 1926. But in the post-war period, which is the next step of my research, I covered primarily the Jubilee of 1925, 1926. But in the post-war period, starting in, as you see, 1946, there were efforts to rewrite his biography and lots of publications even reproduce his name as Georgi, which had connotations of the Orthodox Catholic split and really apocryphal and unsubstantiated claims about his identity and his life trajectory. And the importance of this jubilee is that even though in terms of organization, in terms of ideological reinterpretation, and in terms of the geopolitical competition, it bore a lot in common with many literary jubilees that occurred in the Stalinist and post-Stalinist period. It is often missing in historiography, which is a gap that I'm trying to fill. So with this, I look forward to your questions and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've had 4 very different and fascinating papers. Can we now give floor to the discussion? Please, you can ask your questions.
I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Thank you for all your fascinating presentations. I have one question or comment for Daria. So I imagine that now that there are so many digital copies of everything and catalogs are all digital, and in the past probably you would have to put a particular book on a particular shelf. Okay, this is a Belarus book, this is Ukrainian book. But now you can just add several tags, and then that should make things so much easier, right? You can, next to Karalina, well, okay, Alexievich, you can put several countries, right? So it's not really a complicated question, but if you have any comments on that. Katarzyna, I also have a question. So you said that Latin script was primarily used for Catholics and Cyrillic for Orthodox. How about Greek Catholics, Uniats? How were they seen? And for Dr. Wang, I have a question. Why were you interested in this topic, and how did you find these resources? I remember when I studied at Harvard, I found some very interesting old books on Belarus. I don't know how they ended up there, but if you could talk about your research, where exactly you conducted it, that would be much appreciated. Any more questions?
Vital Byl, University of Bonn. First, to Maria Katarzyna, I guess I express gratitude from many Belarusian researchers for this project. It's something that we really miss. But I would like to clarify, when you are successfully finalize this project, will this model be available for other researchers? And if yes, on which conditions? And also a question to Diego. Probably you know that in Belarusian discourse there is like a junior brother of Francis Karina image is Simon Budny, and already in this jubilee it was already this first glorification of Simon Budny, but he will be presented more in after Second World War time as this more safe Skarina version, when Vilnius is firmly in Lithuanian Soviet Republic and Nesvizh already in Belarusian Soviet Republic, so true Belarusian printing can be traced to Nesvizh. So it's more a comment, but still a question in your research on this jubilee. Can you see in BSSR already this accent on Simon Budny, not only as enlightened, humanist and so on, but already as a continuator of Skarina, this first steps to his transformation in second Skarina.
And I have a question for Lesia. You you talk about visual studies of everyday life, but in your book, there are also texts. So what is the role of academic disciplines like anthropology, ethnography in creating those texts? Because it's not just the visual side you represent, you interpret those. So, yeah.
So we should just deal with these questions and then we'll have another round questions.
Yeah, yeah. So the first one to Dasha.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, for this question. I actually had a slides, and I don't know how I managed to skip that. There is a tags, as you call them, in a library catalogs, but you would think that you can create a tag, and in a library system, actually the tags are prescribed, so you can sort of have a drop-down menu to have them. So there's a choice of the cataloger to choose particular tags, and somehow what I notice and how this the Belarusian collection is done is that they don't go for multiples. So you won't find it'll be one or the other. So, for example, I had the kind of word cloud of the subject headings for Alexievich, and I compared how it's tagged in a Belarusian state library versus the British libraries. And for example, all the Alexievich texts will have the word Belarus in it. None of them, apart from Chernobylskaya Molitva, will have Belarus or Ukraine mentioned in association with Alexievich. But you will have the very big Russian or Russia. So as a tag. So in a sense, I think it connotes language because Russian, but association is clear, and clearly there is a implication of the Soviet experience being translated into Russian experience, which I think needs a different discourse altogether. And so I like your idea. And you in British Library, you won't see the books. You will only obviously see them in a catalog, right? And so what I want to kind of visualize is not a list, but as you say, like a map of like where all these things can link together to see how they, whether it's by the place of the let's say, all the text published, for example, of a particular time period in Vilna or Petersburg or Minsk or whatever, right? Or by author or by period or by language. And that will be way more useful than just to have a list that then you have to click and check.
Yeah, the danger is that if they allow multiple tags, that would kill your PhD topic, right?
That's true. With technology knowledge and digital humanities.
So shall I answer the two next questions?
The chair.
Yeah, okay. So about uniates, yeah, Kalinowski was uniate, and he considered the Latin script as the only possible script that he could use as as a uniate. About Greek Catholics, I don't know, but I think that they also stick to Latin script, but I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure. I have to check on that. Thank you very much for your comment. And Vital, thank you very much for your question. So it's a very ambitious project, and I'm writing now a project proposal. Yeah, so I already wrote twice a project proposal at Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, but it was declined. It was in a bigger CRC. It was rejected. It was situated in a bigger collaborative research center, but due to the financial shortages in Germany, yeah, of course, grants are very, very difficult to get. But my idea is that I will compile a notation system of my own, yeah, with a very experienced computer linguistic colleague of mine, and we would like to introduce orthographic annotation, which is not very common in linguistics, as far to my knowledge. Yeah, like it's typical to annotate for parts of speech, yeah, but it's not typical for orthographic tagging. Yeah, so this is, I don't know how we are going to master that, but of course we have to integrate both alphabets into a multi-layered layout somehow. I don't know. Yeah. So for the technical stuff, my colleague who is not here is the more experienced one. But yeah, I hope it will be accessible to all colleagues who are interested in orthographic annotation and orthographic variation in not only Belarusian, but also in Ruthenian and Polesian and so on and so forth. Yeah, thank you very much.
I think it's Diego's turn.
All right, so the first question is concerns the idea of pursuing this project. So I have spent years studying the efforts by the Soviets to promote pre-Bolshevik literary icons of various Soviet nations as an enterprise in promoting socialist ideology and loyalty to Moscow. So this formed part of the nationality policy efforts to institutionalize national culture in order to create national cultures that would be fully ideologically conforming, but retaining some more vivid external superficial attributes. But this project forms part of a comparative study because many of the other, well, all the other projects for that matter, that I have studied, including the ones that I studied for my PhD dissertation, took place in the Stalinist period and were directed from Moscow, whereas this was a project that was explicitly in competition with members of the community across the international border. There's a geopolitical component to it. There's a strong ideological component to it directed toward the outside. And it took place within Soviet Belarus. It was not celebrated in other parts of the Soviet Union. And for now, all the sources that I have consulted are digitized sources and some sources that I could find in libraries, including secondary sources. And I'm glad that you mentioned some resources housed by Harvard's library, something I have yet to tap into, but I definitely will. If you have any suggestions, I will be tremendously grateful. And in terms of well, this goes into the second question about the legacy of Simon Budny and how he was celebrated. I mean, for now, I have primarily looked at the sources from the mid-1920s, and there were very few allusions to Simon Budny or to the town of Matskievich. But I mean, I have seen a number of publications dated to the late 1980s and early 1990, but the Perestroika period, that's an entirely different context, but I would definitely look into it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Lesia, I think, hasn't responded yet.
So, firstly, we don't have stable material for research. Like our archive updated every day. We have more than 6,600, donators who sent for us photos. And when we're starting to work with books, we're just starting with idea. Like, for example, with these ruins, and all our books connection with currently situation in Belarus. So we published 4 books with portraits in carpet, with carpet background. It was connection how Belarusian present, and it's like nice time 2017, 18. In Belarus, and after during COVID, and we published the books about funeral and wedding together, like 2 parts. And through the text, we like providing to idea how this ritual changed, etc. So, and next books, People of the Forest, we published in 2022, when like the situation on the street totally changed and people don't feel safer walking on the street, and the forest place stays like place for rest. And you can find these all ideas on a text, like text on our books. So we're starting work with idea, we collect the photos, and during this work, we updated what we actually finally want to present. And for last book, Ruins of Belarus, it looks like that. Yeah, we're starting to collect photos and making signature. So the years, who in the photos, etc. And of course, we're starting to edit name of building, what we can see on the photo. And when we published on Instagram, people comment why it's destroyed. And we're starting to add information why it's destroyed and the year which like it happened. And after we like get a comment about who destroyed, like it's destroyed itself. So we add information about like it's Soviet or during the Two World War or etc. And after that, we're starting to make a corpus of text about Belarus, about architecture in Belarus. And now we like just publish this part, first part of like architecture, and make this corpus text through the like Belarusian vision. Like just when we starting to collect the information from many different sources and information like you can use Russian sources or Polish, yeah, many different sites for interpreting history of this building, and we starting to do it from Belarusian side. So and we still like just I don't know, like we're just starting doing it, and it's not our first plan. We just want to publish the books with photo, and now we make a corpus of text about architecture.
Second round of questions. The last round.
Okay, I will have a quick question for Lesia. When you mentioned that you welcome collaborations with artists, I understand more or less, but academics in different Belarusian studies, I just wonder about some examples of what you have in mind about that. And to Dasha, well, building on the previous comment about architecture being the problem for the British Library, I just feel like they have a lot of examples to be inspired by. And I think a lot of systems of storing knowledge right now have moved on to what you say are map structures, or I would call them network structures rather than tree-like structures like in Total Commander, because it is absolutely impossible to operate or transform information into knowledge without a network structure. And if you take things like Obsidian or reference software like Zotero, they do have tags, but also categories or like collections. But if you put a thing in your collection, something within your library in a collection in Zotero, it doesn't exclude it from being put in another collection, as many collections as you want. So it feels like quite a self-imposed and self-limiting problem that they created for themselves. But I imagine that it is hard to change an institution like British Library. And since you engage with them in the form of this dialogue, which also features the word decoloniality, I imagine they are interested in listening to some ideas, so possibly they will ignore you, or maybe you will propose something that will become useful to them in the end, because if you have to impose on yourself a decision to whom Kalinowski belongs, it feels like probably British Library would not like to be in a position to make such decisions, and they would lose, because even when Kalinowski was reburied, to the best of my knowledge, they demonstrated the solution by putting his name in 3 different spellings on the tomb, as well as other rebels from that uprising. But anyway, I had another small question, hopefully small, related to the spelling of names and proper nouns, because I had to deal with it at some point, and other scholars like my Swedish colleague who wrote something for Irish archaeology confirmed the same thing, that when you have to make a choice for spelling of a certain proper noun or place name, it is a political choice in a way, and the decision that you make like demonstrates where you stand. So in my writing, the way I call, or like I write Polotsk or names of people, transformed through time. And just wondered, because in your presentation they were spelled like from Russian transcription, what you think about that, and whether we should somehow stick to something specific and how it impacts your research.
Any more questions in the room? Okay, two more questions. And by the way, Dr. Wang, you may want to contact Anna Rakityanskaya, who is a librarian in charge of Belarusian collection at Widener Library. So he may be your contact point to learn more about what Harvard has.
I had a question for Maria Katarzyna, a very interesting project. I was curious about pre-tonic yakanya and whether you had included proclitic elements like the negative particle nie and the preposition bez, so niehocham, biaznas.
No, because this would falsify my data.
Right. Okay.
That's why I.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
One more question. I guess that's the last.
Thank you. Just a brief remark about units. They conducted their services in the Cyrillic, and they use Cyrillic when they published books. So just like we all in Belarus, we studied the history of Belarus at school, and then at the university there is an obligatory exam in the Belarusian language about the Belarusian history. That is why the units are just a common knowledge. So my question is also about Kastus Kalinowski to Nini. Don't you think that it's exactly the wrong choice of the script that causes the failure of the revolution? So his attempt was in 1864, 1865, and according to the first Russian Empire census, the population on that territory, on the western region, was 90% illiterate, number one, 80% Orthodox. So when he tried to make a revolution within such a community, don't you think that using Latin script, so this attempt is simply miserable?
By the way, do you know which version of Latin Nasha Niva is using these days? Because they have an analyzed version. Yeah. So I guess that's it, right? Thank you for your questions.
Answer first, yeah. About academic. Yeah. So I can, maybe two examples. It's the first Volga Lobachevskaya. She used our archive from last two books, her. Another one, Sergei Gruntov, who published the biggest maybe study about about Belarusian photography. It's one of book about Belarusian photography, which biggest part of his research based on VEHA archive. On VEHA website, you can find the photos, and we have professional catalog. So in Belarusian version and Latin, and we actually using Belarusian Latin. It doesn't matter, but we have English and Belarusian version. And at the moment, VEHA archive is the biggest photographic archive which available online. So it's one sources what you can use, and it's focused only in Belarusian photography, because we have some sources in like Soviet area or Ukrainians, etc. But it's complicated sometimes to found on archives for like Dasha presentable, because the archives many photos describing like Poland or Russian Empire, etc. Yeah, so it's maybe directly sources for your work if you study Belarusian photography.
Yeah, thank you very for the question. The question of, I feel like what you ask is basically the question of sort of who dictates the epistemological standard in a way, with spellings and with kind of categorization of knowledge. I completely agree with you that there has to be a certain text or collection of texts can be put in different collections, but library still needs to identify them. So the project is figuring out into what collections can different Belarusian materials belong, and they can overlap, but this identification has to happen. And in the previous iteration of this project, the idea was, can we create an identity-based collection? And clearly all these questions, like as a sort of, can we have like a Belarusian identity thing? And it did not work. Like it's really difficult to navigate that. Specifically for these questions, we can't answer these questions, and it's difficult to draw these boundaries, which clearly the library kind of needs. But there is a possibility to identify, okay, we can work with, from this position, this can be the collection that we can look at, but also the same materials can be in this collection if we're looking from, let's say, from the printing point of view, or from a linguistic point of view, or from whatever other points of view. So, but that has to be identified, and then kind of the boundaries of the collection outlined with the materials to be added to that. As for kind of related point, all of these things are, it feels like we're dealing with layers of, I don't know, epistemological control that ultimately ends with Library of Congress. Mm-hmm. That there is a lot that library cannot do because it's dictated from this sort of centralized knowledge holder that is really, 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 really difficult to negotiate with. And therefore, for example, my spellings, you say they're Russian spellings, they're actually Library of Congress spellings that I had to spend a year arguing with my supervisors that, can I please spell the way I want to spell, because I'm decolonizing things. And you break your head, you can't really. But obviously there is a kind of alternative spellings of things. You can see Postcolonial is spelled in properly, but you don't know. But it is only because it's the transliteration of Library of Congress of Belarusian texts. So if text is written in Russian, it will be transliterated in Russian. So all of that basically is you're dealing with layers and layers and layers of control that actually is even beyond the control of the British Library. Mm-hmm. But they do need to know that the things can change. And for example, the case of Ukraine is a case where it's possible to negotiate faster changes with the Library of Congress if the political situation dictates that. Because there is an alignment with some sort of values, which is not the case with Belarus, because clearly here as well, the political situation is also very complex. They can't figure out how to align with the state policy versus the diaspora or people who are not in support of the political regime in Belarus. So all of that becomes very, very messy. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Tanya, for your comment. Yeah, and again about our friend Kastus Kalinowski. Yeah, your your comment is valuable. Yeah, because of course he chose a script that was not the script of the majority, and of course the majority of Belarusians at that time, and as far as I remember, the first census was of 1897. Were about 80% illiterate. So this was comparable with the situation when Nasza Niwa and Nasza Dolia appeared, and all of the other newspapers. And so people would generally, they would sit together and there would be someone who would read out loud the newspaper. So as for the question of the script, I do not think that this was very decisive. But it was decisive, the religious denomination in which script you could read out loud the newspaper, yeah? And as far to my knowledge about the Uniates, they were divided. They knew, some of them knew Cyrillic and some of them knew Latin script. But I don't know how the situation is with Greek Catholics, yeah. Yeah, yeah, okay, so it's basically the same, but yeah, it's a very interesting question, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we'll conclude with this discussion. Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating panel, fascinating conference. Over to you. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.